On the morning of March 12, 2023, residents of the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Heights awoke to the wail of police sirens. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a modest two-bedroom home at the end of Maple Street, where 32-year-old Eliza Martinez lay dead in a pool of her own blood. The discovery of her body would unravel a complex web of deception, illness, and rage that had been building for months between Martinez and her boyfriend, 35-year-old James Calloway. What began as a modern love story, one of acceptance and new beginnings, had deteriorated into a nightmare of betrayal, disease, and ultimately murder. The investigation would reveal how a relationship once celebrated for its openness and honesty had harbored devastating secrets that would prove fatal for one partner and life-destroying for the other. James Calloway was, by all accounts, a man of routine. A software developer at a local tech firm, his colleagues described him as methodical, reserved, and intensely private. His small circle of friends knew him as loyal and dependable, if somewhat conventional in his worldview. That was until he met Eliza Martinez at a mutual friend's housewarming party in the summer of 2021. Martinez stood out in any room. With her vibrant personality, quick wit, and striking appearance, she commanded attention without seeking it. Friends described her as unapologetically herself, a quality that had served her well through her transition, which she had completed 2 years before meeting Calloway. Their connection was immediate and intense. Text messages recovered from their phones showed a relationship that bloomed rapidly, with both expressing sentiments of having found someone who truly understood them. For Martinez, Calloway represented acceptance without fetishization, a rarity in her dating experience. For Calloway, Martinez embodied the authenticity and vivacity he had found lacking in previous relationships. James was open about Eliza being transgender from the beginning, said Marcus Rivera, Calloway's closest friend and the host of the party where the couple met. He wasn't hung up on labels, he just saw her as Eliza, this amazing woman who made him happier than I'd ever seen him. By November 2021, the couple had moved in together, merging their lives in the modest home on Maple Street that would later become a crime scene. Neighbors recalled them as a private but friendly couple, often seen walking their adopted sheltered dog, a German Shepherd mix named Apollo, around the neighborhood in the evenings. The first cracks in the relationship's foundation appeared in the spring of 2022, though they weren't visible to outside observers at the time. Financial records would later show Martinez making frequent trips to a neighboring city, approximately an hour's drive from Oakwood Heights. Credit card statements revealed hotel charges, restaurant bills for two, and rideshare receipts for late-night transportation. Meanwhile, Calloway's social media activity during this period reflected nothing amiss. His posts showed the typical documentation of a contented domestic life: home-cooked meals shared with Martinez, weekend hikes with Apollo, and the occasional night out with friends, always with Martinez by his side in the photos. But by June 2022, something had changed. Colleagues at the tech firm where Calloway worked noticed a shift in his demeanor. Always punctual before, he began arriving late to morning meetings. His typically immaculate code became riddled with errors. He withdrew from office social events and was observed taking numerous personal calls in the stairwell, returning to his desk with reddened eyes. "We thought maybe he was dealing with family issues," said Rebecca Chin, a fellow developer who worked closely with Calloway. "He'd always been so private that no one felt comfortable asking directly. Now, I wonder if we should have." What his colleagues didn't know was that Calloway had begun experiencing concerning health symptoms. Medical records obtained during the investigation revealed that in May 2022, he had visited his primary care physician, complaining of persistent fatigue, night sweats, and unexplained weight loss. Initial tests were inconclusive, and he was referred to a specialist. On June 17, 2022, Calloway received a diagnosis that would alter the course of his life and ultimately end Martinez's. He tested positive for HIV. For Calloway, the diagnosis was more than a health crisis. It was a mathematical impossibility within the context of his understanding of his relationship. According to all witness testimonies and digital evidence, he had been in an exclusive relationship with Martinez since their meeting. Medical records confirmed that Martinez had disclosed her HIV-negative status at the beginning of their relationship, showing Calloway test results from 3 months before they met. The inescapable conclusion that Martinez had been intimate with someone else and contracted the virus during their relationship shattered Calloway's reality. Digital forensics would later reveal his desperate search for answers in the days following his diagnosis. His internet history showed repeated searches for information about HIV transmission, window periods for testing, and the statistical likelihood of false positives. But the tests were confirmed, and reality couldn't be denied. Calloway had been infected during his relationship with Martinez, who had clearly been unfaithful. Rather than confronting Martinez immediately, Calloway began his own investigation. Cell phone records show that during the 2 weeks following his diagnosis, he called in sick to work multiple times, unusual for a man who had previously prided himself on never missing a day. During these absences, his vehicle's GPS placed him in the neighboring city where Martinez had been making her unexplained trips. Social media proved to be Calloway's most valuable investigative tool. Through methodical examination of location tags and mutual friends, he identified a pattern of overlap between Martinez's visits to the neighboring city and the activities of one individual, 29-year-old Omar Reynolds, a bartender at a popular LGBTQ+ nightclub called Spectrum. Photos recovered from Martinez's cloud storage would later confirm what Calloway had begun to suspect. Hidden in a password-protected folder were dozens of intimate images of Martinez and Reynolds together, dating back to February 2022, just 3 months after she had moved in with Calloway. Most damning of all was a text message exchange between Martinez and Reynolds from April 2022, in which Reynolds informed her of his recent HIV diagnosis and urged her to get tested. Martinez's reply indicated shock but not discontinuation of their relationship. Subsequent messages showed her informing Reynolds that her test had come back negative, a fact that investigators would later determine to be false. By early July 2022, Calloway had amassed a digital dossier of evidence documenting Martinez's affair and her knowledge of Reynolds' HIV status. Yet he remained silent, continuing to share meals, a bed, and a life with the woman who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. What investigators would later piece together about Eliza Martinez painted a picture of a woman living a dangerous double life. While presenting herself to Calloway as a devoted partner, she was maintaining an intense physical relationship with Omar Reynolds. And after learning of Reynolds' HIV status, she had made a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. She chose not to disclose her potential exposure to Calloway. Medical records obtained during the investigation revealed that Martinez had indeed tested positive for HIV in late April 2022, contrary to what she had told Reynolds. She had sought treatment at a clinic in a third city, farther away, presumably to avoid detection. She had begun antiretroviral therapy immediately but had continued sexual relations with both Reynolds and Calloway. Most states have laws criminalizing the knowing transmission of HIV without disclosure, and this case would certainly have qualified had it proceeded to a normal legal conclusion. Martinez's deliberate concealment of her status from Calloway, while continuing their physical relationship, represented not just a betrayal of trust but a criminal act. Friends of Martinez, interviewed after her death, expressed shock at this behavior, which seemed wildly out of character for a woman they had known as compassionate and ethical. Some speculated that fear had driven her decisions. Fear of losing Calloway, fear of stigma, fear of confronting the reality of her diagnosis. Eliza had faced so much rejection in her life, said Tanya Nguyen, a close friend of Martinez for over a decade. I think the thought of losing James, who had accepted her so completely, was just too much to bear. It doesn't excuse what she did, but I think that's why she made such terrible choices. For 2 months, Martinez maintained this precarious balancing act between her two relationships, her secret diagnosis and her treatment. During this time, Calloway continued gathering evidence, saying nothing as his own health deteriorated due to the early stages of HIV infection that he had yet to treat, apparently waiting for incontrovertible proof before confronting Martinez. The events of July 28, 2022 have been reconstructed from a combination of physical evidence, digital forensics, and Calloway's eventual confession. That morning began like any other. Neighbors reported seeing Martinez walking Apollo at her usual time, around 6:30 a.m. Calloway, who typically left for work by 7:15 a.m., called in sick for the third consecutive day. Security camera footage from a house across the street captured Martinez returning home at 6:52 a.m. This would be the last time she was seen alive by anyone other than Calloway. At 7:14 a.m., Calloway conducted a final internet search on his phone, legal consequences of intentional HIV transmission. At 7:17 a.m., he sent a text message to his supervisor stating he would be out sick again. At 7:19 a.m., He took a screenshot of a particularly intimate photo of Martinez and Reynolds together. What transpired inside the house over the next several hours can only be inferred from the physical evidence. Forensic analysis indicated that a confrontation began in the living room, where a coffee mug was shattered on the floor. The argument apparently moved to the kitchen, where investigators found Martinez's phone submerged in a sink full of water, possibly an attempt by Calloway to destroy evidence of the affair, not realizing he had already preserved copies. The fatal violence occurred in the bedroom. Blood spatter analysis suggested that Martinez was initially struck while standing near the closet, then fell to the floor where the assault continued. The medical examiner's report documented 37 separate stab wounds, primarily concentrated on the chest and face, a pattern often associated with crimes of passion, where the perpetrator seeks to destroy the identity of the victim. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the couple's own cutlery set, was found still clutched in Calloway's hand when police arrived. He had made no attempt to flee, clean the scene, or dispose of evidence. When officers entered the home, responding to a concerned call from a neighbor who had heard screaming, they found Calloway sitting on the edge of the bed, covered in Martinez's blood, staring at her body. His first words to the responding officers, according to their report, were not a denial or explanation, but a question. "Did you know she gave me HIV?" The arrest of James Calloway was without incident. In the hours of questioning that followed, he provided a full confession, meticulously detailing the timeline of his discovery, investigation, and ultimate violent rage. The district attorney's office initially charged him with first-degree murder, indicating premeditation based on his weeks of evidence gathering without confrontation. The case immediately captured national media attention, igniting complex and often contentious discussions about disclosure, infidelity, transgender relationships, and the criminal transmission of HIV. Advocacy groups on various sides of these issues released statements, some portraying Calloway as a victim of deception who had snapped under unimaginable stress, others emphasizing that no betrayal could justify such violence against a transgender woman, a demographic already disproportionately affected by violent crime. Meanwhile, a separate investigation into Omar Reynolds determined that he had disclosed his HIV status to Martinez promptly upon learning of it himself. He was devastated to learn not only of Martinez's death, but of her deception regarding her own status and the fact that she had continued her relationship with Calloway without disclosure. Reynolds tested positive for the same strain of HIV that had infected both Martinez and Calloway, confirming the chain of transmission. The legal proceedings against Calloway took an unexpected turn when his defense team negotiated a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree murder, the prosecution agreed to recommend a reduced sentence, citing the extraordinary circumstances of the case. The judge ultimately sentenced Calloway to 18 years in prison, below the typical range for such an offense, acknowledging the complex factors that had led to the crime, while emphasizing that they did not justify it. Calloway also received proper medical treatment for his HIV infection while in custody, with doctors confirming that with ongoing antiretroviral therapy, he could expect to live a normal lifespan despite the infection. The case of Eliza Martinez and James Calloway defies simple categorization. It is at once a story of acceptance and prejudice, of honesty and deception, of love and betrayal, of victimization and violence. It raises difficult questions about the responsibilities we have to those we love, especially regarding matters of health and fidelity. For the community of Oakwood Heights, the tragedy left lingering trauma. The house on Maple Street remained unoccupied for over a year after the crime, a silent reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Apollo, the couple's dog, was adopted by Marcus Rivera, the friend who had introduced Martinez and Calloway, a bittersweet connection to the relationship that had started so promisingly at his home. The parents of Eliza Martinez established a foundation in her name, focused on education about HIV disclosure laws and support for transgender individuals in crisis. They spoke publicly about the complex emotions of grieving a daughter whose actions they could not condone, while still honoring her humanity and rejecting the violence that took her life. Omar Reynolds left the state shortly after the trial concluded, seeking to escape the notoriety of his connection to the case. Before departing, he gave a single interview in which he expressed remorse for his role in the chain of events, though he maintained that he had acted responsibly by disclosing his status to Martinez immediately. As for James Calloway, he remains incarcerated, his story serving as a cautionary tale about the potentially catastrophic consequences of betrayal and the tragic limitations of human capacity for restraint in the face of profound deception. His case continues to be studied by legal scholars examining the intersection of criminal justice, public health policy, and human psychology. In the quiet neighborhood where Eliza Martinez spent her final months, few physical reminders remain of the tragedy. The crime scene tape is long gone. New tenants eventually moved into the house on Maple Street. The community park where she and Calloway once walked Apollo shows no trace of their presence. Yet the questions raised by their story persist, highlighting the fragile nature of trust, the complexity of modern relationships, and the devastating potential of secrets kept from those closest to us. In a world where acceptance can be hard-won and vulnerability comes at a high price, their tragedy stands as a stark reminder of how quickly love can transform into its opposite when deception undermines its foundation. The small coastal community of Port Haven had never seen a crime scene quite like the one that greeted first responders on the foggy morning of September 8, 2022. The luxurious beachfront condominium at 409 Shoreline Drive, typically a symbol of the town's recent prosperity, had been transformed into a tableau of violence. Inside, amidst shattered glass and overturned furniture, lay the body of 34-year-old Mira Chen, a respected local architect. The brutality of the scene, multiple stab wounds, defensive injuries, and evidence of a prolonged struggle spoke to a crime of extreme passion or hatred. Within 48 hours, police would arrest her boyfriend of 3 years, 36-year-old Dr. Nathan Reeves, a neurologist at Port Haven Memorial Hospital. The case initially appeared straightforward, a domestic homicide born of relationship troubles. But as investigators peeled back the layers of Chen and Reeves' seemingly picture-perfect life together, they uncovered a complex web of deception, betrayal, and a deadly health secret that had pushed Reeves beyond his breaking point. The case would captivate the public not only for its brutal nature, but for the questions it raised about trust, disclosure, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator in the most intimate type of betrayal. Before they became the subjects of true crime discussions and psychological analyses, Mira Chen and Nathan Reeves represented what many considered an aspirational partnership. Chen, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, had built a reputation as a visionary architect whose designs blended functionality with environmental consciousness. Her work had transformed several of Port Haven's public spaces and earned her features in national architecture publications. Reeves had arrived in Port Haven in 2017, recruited by the hospital to head its expanding neurology department. Colleagues described him as brilliant but reserved, passionate about his work but guarded about his personal life. He had grown up in Chicago, attended Johns Hopkins for medical school, and completed his residency at the Mayo Clinic, credentials that had made him a prized recruitment for the small coastal hospital. They met at a hospital fundraising gala in early 2019, where Chen's firm had been recognized for its pro bono redesign of the children's wing. Photographs from the event, later retrieved during the investigation, showed their first encounter. Chen in a striking red dress, laughing at something Reeves, in a classic black tuxedo, had just said. You could see the chemistry instantly, recalled Emma Whitman, the hospital's events coordinator who had been present that night. They gravitated toward each other throughout the evening. By the end, they were sitting at the bar long after most guests had left, deep in conversation. Friends of Chen later reported that she had been immediately drawn to Reeves' intellectual depth and quiet confidence. For his part, Reeves was reportedly captivated by Chen's creative energy and the way she moved easily between different social circles at the event. Their courtship progressed quickly. Social media posts and witness accounts painted a picture of a couple united by shared interests in contemporary art, hiking, and culinary exploration. By summer 2019, Chen had begun introducing Reeves as her partner at professional events. In November of that year, they purchased the beachfront condominium together, a significant step that friends saw as a precursor to eventual marriage. Among their social circle in Port Haven, Chen and Reeves were seen as the power couple, successful professionals who complemented each other perfectly. Chen brought warmth and sociability to the relationship, drawing the more introverted Reeves out of his shell. He in turn provided a steadying presence for Chen, whose creative temperament sometimes led to emotional volatility. When Chen came out to Reeves as transgender early in their relationship, having completed her transition 5 years before meeting him, he had responded with acceptance and support. Friends who knew of Chen's gender history noted that Reeves had never shown any discomfort or hesitation about this aspect of her identity. Nathan was totally devoted to Mira, said Marcus Thompson, a colleague of Reeves at the hospital. He once told me she was the first person he'd ever met who made him feel fully understood. Their relationship seemed to transcend typical categories. They were just perfectly matched. But beneath this appearance of ideal partnership, a series of decisions and deceptions was already in motion that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The investigation into Chen's murder would eventually uncover evidence of a relationship she had been concealing from Reeves for almost a year. Beginning in October 2021, Chen had been regularly traveling to Silver Creek, a city approximately 90 minutes from Port Haven, ostensibly for an ongoing commercial project. While Chen was indeed working on a development in Silver Creek, forensic examination of her digital devices revealed that these trips involved a secondary purpose: meetings with Jordan Russo, a 30-year-old graphic designer who worked at an advertising agency in the city. The relationship between Chen and Russo had begun professionally. Her architectural firm had partnered with Russo's agency on marketing materials for the Silver Creek development, but emails and text messages recovered from Chen's password-protected accounts showed that by late 2021, their interaction had become romantic and sexual in nature. Chen had taken elaborate precautions to conceal the affair. She maintained a separate phone for communications with Russo, stored in her office rather than at home. She had created a complex scheduling system and a password-protected planning app, detailing when Reeves would be working night shifts or attending conferences, creating windows of opportunity for her Silver Creek visits. Hotel receipts, later discovered in a hidden folder on Chen's laptop, showed at least 26 overnight stays at the Silver Lake Grand Hotel between October 2021 and August 2022. Metadata from photographs found on the same laptop confirmed intimate encounters between Chen and Russo during these stays. What made the affair particularly significant to the case was not merely its existence, but a critical health development that occurred in April 2022. Medical records obtained during the investigation showed that Russo had been diagnosed with HIV that month, following routine testing. Text messages between Russo and Chen demonstrated that he had immediately informed her of his diagnosis, urging her to get tested as well. Chen's response had expressed shock and concern, and subsequent messages confirmed that she had indeed sought testing. However, the pivotal deception, the one that would ultimately transform a case of infidelity into something far more sinister, was Chen's decision after receiving her own positive diagnosis. Rather than disclosing her HIV status to Reeves, she had chosen to keep it secret, continuing their intimate relationship while beginning antiretroviral treatment at a clinic in Westfield, a city in the opposite direction from Silver Creek. Investigators would later determine that Chen had used her frequent business trips as cover for both her affair and her medical appointments, maintaining an increasingly complex web of lies to keep these aspects of her life separate from her relationship with Reeves. The catalyst for the violent confrontation occurred on September 5, 2022, 3 days before Chen's murder. Medical records showed that on this date, Dr. Nathan Reeves received his own HIV diagnosis, following tests ordered by his primary care physician for what he had initially believed to be persistent flu symptoms. For Reeves, a physician who understood the implications immediately, this diagnosis presented a baffling and disturbing puzzle. According to all testimony from friends, colleagues, and digital evidence, he had been in an exclusive relationship with Chen since they began dating. There was no evidence whatsoever of any sexual relationships outside of this partnership on Reeves' part. The medical impossibility of his diagnosis, contracting HIV while in what he believed to be a monogamous relationship with someone he trusted to be HIV negative, led to an inevitable conclusion. Chen had been unfaithful and had knowingly exposed him to the virus. Unlike Chen's methodical concealment, Reeves' response to his discovery was chaotic and emotional. His internet search history, recovered during the investigation, showed a frantic pattern in the hours following his diagnosis. HIV transmission rates, window periods for detection, legal penalties for knowingly transmitting HIV, and survival statistics for those infected. By the evening of September 5th, his searches had shifted focus. He began investigating Chen's schedule, looking up the Silver Creek development she had been working on, and searching for information about her frequent collaborators on the project. Security footage from Chen's architectural firm showed Reeves arriving at her office late that night, using the key she had given him. He remained inside for approximately 3 hours, during which time investigators believe he accessed her work computer, discovering emails between Chen and Russo that confirmed his suspicions. On September 6th and 7th, while Chen was in Silver Creek for what she had told Reeves was a critical project meeting, he continued his investigation. Cell tower data placed his phone in Silver Creek on those days, and security footage from the Silver Lake Grand Hotel showed him speaking with front desk staff, likely inquiring about Chen's previous stays. Whether Reeves directly confronted Russo during this time remains unknown. Russo, in subsequent police interviews, claimed no interaction with Reeves prior to the murder. However, a gap in Reeves' cell phone location data during these 2 days suggests he may have left his phone in his vehicle while conducting some portions of his investigation, potentially to avoid being tracked. The events of September 8th have been reconstructed based on forensic evidence, security footage, and Reeves' eventual statements to investigators. Chen returned from Silver Creek late in the evening of September 7th. According to text messages sent to Reeves, she expected him to be working an overnight shift at the hospital. This was accurate according to the original schedule, but records show that Reeves had called in sick, citing a family emergency. Security footage from their condominium building captured Chen arriving home alone at approximately 11:20 p.m. On September 7th. Reeves entered the building at 2:17 a.m. on September 8th, using his key card to access the private elevator to their 18th floor unit. No security cameras were present inside the condominium itself, but the forensic evidence told a grim story of what transpired. The confrontation appeared to have begun in the living room, where a laptop was found open to a folder containing photographs of Chen and Russo together. Wine glasses on the coffee table, one empty, one full, suggested Chen had been caught off guard by Reeves' arrival. The initial argument moved through the condominium, evidenced by toppled furniture and broken decorative items creating a trail from the living room to the kitchen. It was in the kitchen that the confrontation turned violent. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the first blow struck Chen near the refrigerator, likely a punch that caused her to fall against the counter, breaking several glass containers. What followed was a frenzied attack. Reeves seized a chef's knife from the magnetic strip on the wall, a knife that Chen herself had purchased during a culinary tour of Japan, and stabbed her repeatedly. The medical examiner would later count 23 distinct knife wounds concentrated on the chest, neck, and face. The pattern and depth of the wounds indicated extreme rage, with several strikes powerful enough to penetrate bone. Particularly notable to investigators was the extensive damage to Chen's face, suggesting an attempt to destroy her identity, a common feature in crimes where the perpetrator feels profoundly betrayed by someone close to them. The violence continued as Chen attempted to escape, creating a trail of blood through the hallway toward the master bedroom. The final and fatal wounds were delivered near the ensuite bathroom, where her body was found by emergency responders the following morning. After the attack, Reeves made no attempt to flee or conceal his actions. Security footage showed him exiting the building at 4:03 a.m., his clothing visibly stained with blood. He drove directly to the Port Haven Police Department, where he turned himself in, still carrying his blood-covered hospital ID badge. The arrest and subsequent legal proceedings against Dr. Nathan Reeves generated intense media coverage that extended far beyond Port Haven. The case touched on multiple sensitive issues: HIV stigma, disclosure ethics, intimate partner violence, and the legal questions surrounding non-disclosure of HIV status. During his initial questioning, Reeves provided a detailed account of the events leading to Chen's death. He described the shock of his diagnosis, his investigation into Chen's activities, and the confrontation that had escalated to violence. While he expressed remorse for his actions, he maintained that Chen's deception, particularly regarding her HIV status, had constituted a profound betrayal that had temporarily broken something in his mind. Prosecutors initially charged Reeves with first-degree murder, arguing that his 2-day investigation demonstrated premeditation. The defense team, however, built their case around a temporary insanity plea, citing the extreme psychological trauma of simultaneously discovering infidelity and a life-altering medical diagnosis. The trial, which began in March 2023, brought forward extensive testimony about Chen and Reeves' relationship. Jordan Russo testified about his relationship with Chen and confirmed that he had promptly informed her of his HIV diagnosis. Medical experts established the timeline of transmission, confirming that Russo had inadvertently infected Chen, who had then, whether intentionally or through negligence, infected Reeves. Particularly damaging to Chen's posthumous reputation was evidence that she had actively misled Reeves about her HIV status. Her medical records showed that she had received her positive diagnosis in late April 2022 and had immediately begun treatment. Text messages between Chen and Russo during this period revealed her explicit decision not to inform Reeves, expressing fear that disclosure would lead to questions about how she had contracted the virus. Public opinion about the case was deeply divided. Some viewed Reeves as a victim of a profound betrayal who had reacted with uncharacteristic violence to an unimaginable situation. Others emphasized that, regardless of Chen's deception, the brutal nature of the murder could not be justified or excused. Several HIV advocacy organizations issued statements condemning both Chen's non-disclosure and the media's sometimes sensationalistic coverage of the HIV aspect of the case. They emphasized that modern antiretroviral therapy makes HIV a manageable chronic condition, rather than the death sentence it was once perceived to be, and expressed concern that the case might reinforce stigma and fear surrounding the virus. After 2 weeks of testimony and 4 days of jury deliberation, Reeves was convicted of second-degree murder rather than the first-degree charge sought by the prosecution. The jury appeared to accept that while his actions were not justified, the extreme circumstances had affected his mental state and capacity for premeditation. In June 2023, Judge Elaine Watkins sentenced Reeves to 22 years in prison, noting the exceptional circumstances of the case, while emphasizing that betrayal, no matter how profound, cannot justify taking another human life. The case of Mira Chen and Nathan Reeves left a lasting impact on the community of Port Haven. The condominium where the murder occurred remained unsold for over a year, despite its prime location, eventually selling for well below market value to an out-of-state buyer unfamiliar with its history. Chen's architectural firm, which she had built from the ground up, was dissolved following her death, with ongoing projects transferred to competitor firms. A scholarship in her name was established at the State University's School of Architecture, focusing specifically on supporting transgender students in the field, a recognition of the barriers Chen herself had overcome in her career. Jordan Russo moved away from Silver Creek shortly after the trial concluded, reportedly struggling with guilt over his role in the chain of events despite having acted responsibly by disclosing his status to Chen. In a single interview given to a national magazine, he expressed profound regret about the relationship but maintained that he could never have anticipated its tragic outcome. Reeves began serving his sentence at Northern State Correctional Facility, where he reportedly established a peer counseling program for inmates living with HIV. His medical license was revoked, but he found purpose in educating the prison population about disease prevention and management. According to correctional staff, he never denied responsibility for Chen's death, but spoke often about the importance of honesty in intimate relationships. The legal community continues to cite the case in discussions about HIV non-disclosure laws and their enforcement. Several states have since reviewed their statutes, clarifying the legal obligations of HIV-positive individuals to disclose their status to sexual partners, while also acknowledging the advances in treatment that have transformed the prognosis for those living with the virus. For the residents of Port Haven, the case serves as a somber reminder of how quickly the appearance of perfection can shatter. The tragedy revealed how even in relationships that seem ideal from the outside, between educated, successful individuals who appeared to communicate openly, devastating secrets can fester. Perhaps most disturbingly, the case illustrated how a series of individual decisions, Chen's choice to begin an affair, Russo's unwitting transmission of HIV, Chen's subsequent decision to conceal her diagnosis, and finally, Reeves' violent response to discovery, could combine to create an outcome that none of the participants could have imagined at the outset. As one local columnist wrote in a reflection piece on the anniversary of Chen's death, the tragedy of Mira Chen and Nathan Reeves reminds us that trust, once broken in the most intimate spheres of our lives, can shatter with unforeseeable consequences. Their story is not simply about infidelity or illness or violence, but about the fundamental human need for honesty from those we love, and the sometimes terrible cost of its absence. Today, the beach near the former home of Chen and Reeves remains a popular spot for Port Haven residents and tourists. Few of the sunbathers and swimmers are aware that they lounge in the shadow of what was once the scene of the town's most notorious crime of passion, a testament to how communities eventually absorb and move beyond even the most shocking violations of their peace. But in legal circles, psychology classrooms, and HIV advocacy organizations, the case continues to be studied, a complex cautionary tale about deception, betrayal, and the volatile alchemy of love, transformed into its destructive opposite. On the morning of June 15, 2023, in the quiet town of Brunswick, Maine, Daniel O'Connor stood outside his modest coastal home, staring out at the Androscoggin River. For years, this house had been his sanctuary, a place where he built dreams with his wife Jessica and their 3 children. But everything changed when an innocent family project turned into his worst nightmare. What started as a simple DNA test for a school ancestry assignment ended up exposing a truth that shattered his entire world. This is the story of Daniel, a man who found the uncomfortable truth about his family, which led him to commit an unimaginable crime. Daniel, a 35-year-old contractor, had always been a hands-on father, involved in every aspect of his children's lives. He took them fishing on weekends, helped with their homework, and cheered them on at soccer games. His wife, Jessica, was well-liked in the community, known for her involvement at the Brunswick Town Library and local charities. They were the picture-perfect family. Or so it seemed. The DNA test results arrived on a warm afternoon in late May. Daniel had picked up the envelope from their mailbox, not thinking much of it. He handed it to Jessica with a smile, joking about uncovering some long-lost family secrets. But when Jessica hesitated, a flicker of unease crossed his mind. She insisted they open it later, but curiosity got the better of him. Sitting at their kitchen table, Daniel tore the envelope open and scanned the report. His heart pounded. None of the 3 children shared his DNA. He sat frozen, staring at the report, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. Jessica stood nearby, wringing her hands nervously, avoiding his gaze. For a moment, Daniel convinced himself there had to be an explanation. A mix-up at the lab, maybe a clerical error. But deep down, an unsettling feeling told him otherwise. He grabbed his phone and dialed the customer service number printed at the bottom of the page. The voice on the other end confirmed the accuracy of the results, shattering any lingering hope he had. Jessica finally broke down, admitting that the children were not his. She spoke in a quiet voice, revealing that the truth had been hidden for years, buried beneath layers of lies and pretense. Daniel felt his stomach churn, the weight of her confession crashing over him like a wave. He could barely process her words as she explained how it all happened, how she had kept it from him for so long. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a stranger's place. Every framed photo on the walls, every memory-filled corner seemed like a cruel joke. Daniel couldn't help but think of the countless times he had kissed his children goodnight, reassured them when they were scared, and told them he would always be there for them. The thought that none of it was real made his chest tighten. Jessica tried to reach for his hand, but Daniel pulled away, unable to look at her. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over, and stormed out of the house without a word. The cool evening air did little to calm him. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, replaying the past 15 years in his head, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything went wrong. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He reread the results, checked the names, and even called the testing company. The confirmation hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't their father. Confusion quickly turned to anger, and he demanded answers from Jessica. She sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. It took hours before she finally admitted the truth. Their children were fathered by Eric Thompson, Daniel's best friend. Before we continue our story, remember to click the subscribe button to get more of these and enjoy. Let's continue. Eric had been a part of their lives for as long as Daniel could remember. They met in high school and had remained close ever since. Eric was always around. Family barbecues, birthdays, holidays. Daniel never suspected anything. The betrayal cut deeper than he ever thought possible. He tried to remember moments when Jessica and Eric were alone together, times when they shared a glance or a quiet conversation, and suddenly, it all made sense in ways that left him feeling sick to his stomach. The following days were a blur. Daniel could barely focus at work, his mind consumed by thoughts of betrayal. He would find himself gripping his tools too tightly, staring off into the distance, lost in dark thoughts. Colleagues noticed a change in him, but he brushed it off with forced smiles. He couldn't let anyone know what was happening inside his head. Jessica tried to explain, to apologize, but Daniel couldn't listen. He couldn't even look at her without seeing Eric's face in his mind. He started avoiding home, spending long hours driving aimlessly through Brunswick, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The rage was building inside him, and it felt like a ticking time bomb. Over the following weeks, Daniel's emotions spiraled out of control. He felt humiliated, deceived, and lost. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, but he kept a calm facade. He continued to go to work, smile at his neighbors, and attend family events. But inside, he was planning something sinister. Late at night, he would sit in his truck, staring at the dark silhouette of their home, imagining different ways to make them pay for what they'd done to him. On the evening of August 10, Daniel suggested to Jessica that they take a short getaway to their cabin on Merrymeeting Bay. He told her they needed to reconnect, to fix their marriage. Jessica, eager to mend things, agreed. They packed their bags and left the next morning, driving through the winding forest roads that led to their secluded retreat. The air was heavy with humidity, and the thick canopy of trees cast long shadows over the narrow path. The longest shadows obscured the village until that same evening, when they found their way back to the garage with the body. When they landed, they immediately covered themselves with baseball hats. The cabin, nestled far in the woods, was a place of many cherished memories. Jessica smiled as she stepped onto the familiar wooden porch, recalling summers spent fishing and laughing by the lake. But Daniel had transformed it into something else entirely. Unbeknownst to her, he had spent days preparing, setting up fishing nets and other gear in specific spots around the property. He meticulously planned every step, ensuring that it would look like a tragic accident. He even cleared away footprints and repositioned furniture to make it seem as though nothing had changed. As the sun set over the water, Daniel convinced Jessica to join him by the dock. He spoke softly, reminiscing about their past, creating a false sense of security. He pointed out the spot where they had once watched fireworks on their anniversary, stirring up old emotions. When she least expected it, he pushed her into the water. The nets he'd rigged tightened around her, trapping her in a web of rope and weight. He pulled her to his side to cover her. The wind raged, both of them without armor. The night, Jessica struggled, thrashing and gasping, but the secluded location ensured no one could hear her cries. The water was ice cold despite the warm summer evening, and Jessica's movements grew weaker as panic set in. Her fingers clawed at the ropes, but they only tightened with each desperate pull. Daniel stood above, watching with a blank expression, his hands gripping the wooden railing tightly. The reflection of the moon on the water shimmered as her body disappeared beneath the surface. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped back from the dock, his mind racing. He knew he had to act quickly. He retrieved her shoes and belongings from the cabin and carefully arranged them near the shore. He placed a wineglass on the porch, still half full, to suggest she had been enjoying a quiet evening by the water before slipping and falling in. Daniel stood motionless, watching as the water swallowed her. He felt a strange sense of relief. Closure, perhaps. After what seemed like an eternity, he carefully staged the scene. He drove her car to the edge of the bay, leaving her purse and shoes nearby to make it look like she had slipped and drowned. He even made sure to wipe down the steering wheel and door handles, removing any traces of his fingerprints. He held his head down, and regret flooded him just as he reached the shore. In his mind, every detail was accounted for, and no one would suspect a thing. As he walked back to the cabin that night, the weight of what he had done settled heavily on his shoulders. The familiar creak of the wooden floor under his feet felt different, eerie even. He poured himself a drink, staring out at the dark waters, half expecting to see Jessica's face emerge from the depths. But the water remained still, and so did his expression. The next morning, he called the police, his voice trembling as he reported Jessica missing. Authorities arrived within hours, and an official search was launched. Boats scoured the bay, and officers combed the surrounding woods. Daniel played the role of a grieving husband perfectly, answering questions, sobbing in front of the cameras, and pleading for help. He even held Jessica's favorite scarf, pressing it to his face as if seeking comfort in her scent. Paralyzed, Detective Sarah Lindell, an experienced investigator, quickly grew suspicious. Something about Daniel's story didn't sit right with her. Surveillance footage from nearby gas stations showed Jessica's car arriving at the bay earlier than Daniel claimed they had left the cabin. His timeline didn't add up. She noticed Daniel's nervous habits, his fingers tapping on the table during questioning, his eyes darting away when she pressed him on details. It was subtle, but Sarah had seen enough liars in her career to recognize the signs. As the search dragged on, Daniel's facade started to crack. He avoided eye contact with neighbors who offered their condolences and flinched at the sound of his phone ringing. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. Then, Eric came forward. Racked with guilt, he confessed to the affair but insisted he had no idea Daniel knew the truth. He claimed that his intentions were never to break up the family, and that he had distanced himself after Jessica ended the affair years ago. However, his confession only fueled the growing doubts surrounding Daniel's version of events. Detective Lindell meticulously pieced together the timeline, pointing out the inconsistencies between Daniel's statements and Eric's revelation. Under mounting pressure, Daniel's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. During the intense interrogation, Daniel finally admitted what he had done. He recounted the moment he learned the truth about the children and how the betrayal had consumed him. He described how he spent sleepless nights obsessing over every lie, every moment he had unknowingly been deceived. When he spoke about his plan and execution, his voice was disturbingly calm, showing no remorse for his actions. The investigators were taken aback by his lack of emotion, as if he had detached himself from the horror of his crime. The trial took place at the Cumberland County Courthouse on November 3, 2023. The courtroom was packed with community members who once admired the O'Connors, now eager to see justice served. Family members of both Daniel and Jessica sat in opposing rows, their faces pale and tense. Daniel pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, avoiding a lengthy trial that would have further exposed the painful details of their family's downfall. The judge, emphasizing the calculated and deliberate nature of the crime, sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, stating that his actions were driven by a deep-seated need for revenge that showed a complete disregard for human life. After the verdict was read, Jessica's sister broke down in tears, clutching a photograph of her late sibling. The town, once united by admiration for the seemingly perfect family, was now divided. Some believed that Daniel was a victim of betrayal, while others saw him as a cold-blooded killer. The media swarmed the courthouse steps, capturing the emotional aftermath as both families left in silence. The ATM, Daniel, led away in handcuffs, stared blankly ahead, his face void of any visible regret. Jessica's death sent shockwaves through Brunswick. The town struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. The children, now left without parents, were placed in the care of Jessica's sister, who moved them out of town to escape the media frenzy. In prison, Daniel's days became monotonous, filled with regret and the realization that his need for revenge had destroyed everything he once held dear. He often sat in his cell, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment he pushed Jessica into the water over and over again. The community, once united, found itself divided, some blaming Daniel entirely, while others whispered about Jessica's betrayal. But in the end, it was a story of loss, deception, and a man pushed to the edge by the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. But what happened next was even more disturbing. The next story reveals a shocking case of betrayal and revenge, where a woman's actions pushed a man to his breaking point. You won't believe what he did to get even. Keep watching to find out what happened in the next story. In Lancaster, California, a quiet suburban neighborhood that seemed peaceful on the surface became the backdrop for a devastating event in 2021. Jermarcus Lamar David, a 32-year-old father of 4, shared a modest home with his wife Lindsay Candy and their children. Jermarcus worked tirelessly as a security guard, often taking on night shifts to ensure his family's financial stability. To neighbors and friends, they seemed like any other family navigating the everyday challenges of life. This is the story of a man who hunted his wife because she betrayed him in the most unimaginable way, shattering his trust and his family in the process. For years, Jermarcus and Lindsay's marriage had been strained. Disagreements about money, long work hours, and the stress of raising 4 children had put a heavy burden on their relationship. Jermarcus often felt like his efforts went unnoticed, but he kept going for the sake of his family. Yet, something about Lindsay had changed in recent months. She seemed distant and distracted. She was spending more time away from home, often giving vague reasons for her absences. At night, Jermarcus noticed how she would sit with her phone, quickly locking the screen when he came near. At first, he thought it was just stress. With everything they had been through, it wasn't unusual to have rough patches. But a comment from a friend turned his doubts into something he couldn't ignore. His friend mentioned how many families had uncovered surprising truths about their heritage through DNA tests. It was an innocent suggestion, but it sparked something in Jermarcus. Curious and unsettled, he decided to order DNA kits for himself and the children. He told himself it was just a fun experiment, a way to learn about their roots. Deep down, though, he wanted reassurance, to silence the nagging thoughts in his mind. The test results arrived on April 20, 2021. Marcus opened the envelope with a mix of excitement and nervousness, expecting to see something about distant relatives or shared ancestry. Instead, the results brought his world crashing down. 3 of his 4 sons, Dylan, Ethan, and Lucas, did not share his DNA. Only his youngest child, Noah, was biologically his. The words on the page felt like a punch to his chest. He read them over and over, hoping he had misunderstood. But the truth was undeniable. In the days that followed, Jamarcus tried to hold himself together, but the weight of the betrayal was too much. He replayed memories in his mind, wondering how he could have been so blind. On April 22, 2021, Jamarcus decided to confront Lindsay. She was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone when he calmly asked her if she had ever been unfaithful. Lindsay hesitated for a moment, then laughed nervously, brushing off his question. But Jamarcus wasn't smiling. His steady gaze made her shift uncomfortably, and she quickly changed the subject. That night, Jamarcus barely slept. The doubt, anger, and sadness churned inside him, making him feel like a stranger in his own home. The screams went on. He lost all control over his emotions. He dug his hands into his eyes, making him feel like a stranger in his own home. The next morning, Jamarcus began looking through old family documents and photos, searching for something, anything, that might give him clarity. He stumbled upon receipts for trips Lindsay had taken alone, claiming they were for work. One of the receipts was for a luxurious resort in Palm Springs, dated September 2018. She had told him it was a work conference, but now he wasn't so sure. The dates didn't align with anything she had mentioned before. Determined to uncover more, Jamarcus ventured into the attic, a place he rarely visited. Amid dusty boxes, he found a hidden compartment in one of Lindsay's old suitcases. Inside was a box of letters addressed to someone named M. They were romantic and dated back several years. Some letters detailed secret meetings, complete with locations and dates. One letter, dated March 15, 2019, described a weekend trip to San Diego, where Lindsay had told Jamarcus she was visiting a sick relative. Jamarcus's hands trembled as he read them, each word fueling his anger and heartbreak. Later that day, he found himself looking through family photos stored on an old USB drive. As he scrolled through the pictures, he noticed something odd, a photo of Lindsay at a dinner party he didn't recognize. She was sitting close to a man he had never seen before, laughing, her hand casually resting on his arm. The photo was dated June 2020, a time when she had claimed to be working late shift. On April 23, 2021, Jamarcus returned home from work unusually quiet. Lindsay noticed his withdrawn demeanor but didn't press him. That night, he barely spoke a word, his mind replaying every moment of their relationship, questioning every smile, every promise, every time she said she loved him. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the living room staring into the darkness, plotting his next move. The following morning, April 24, 2021, Jamarcus came home from his night shift earlier than usual. In his possession was a gun he had purchased years ago for protection but rarely thought about. The weight of it in his hand felt surreal, like a physical manifestation of his anger and heartbreak. Lindsay was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Jamarcus confronted her. He demanded answers, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. Lindsay froze, her face pale as she realized the depth of his knowledge. She tried to deny it at first, but Jamarcus's persistence and evidence left no room for lies. Finally, she admitted to the affairs, but her tone shifted between regret and defiance, further fueling Jamarcus's anger. The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the house. The children, still in their rooms, overheard the commotion but stayed quiet, too afraid to intervene. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, Jamarcus raised the gun and fired. Lindsay collapsed to the floor, her body lifeless. The sound of the gunshot sent the children into panic. Dylan, the eldest at 18, rushed out of his room to find his mother on the ground and his father standing over her, weapon in hand. Jamarcus turned to him, his face a mask of anger and pain. He accused Dylan of being a constant reminder of Lindsay's betrayal. Before Dylan could respond or flee, Jamarcus pulled the trigger again. The chaos unfolded quickly. Ethan, 14, and Lucas, 12, tried to hide, but Jamarcus hunted them down within the confines of their home. The small house, once filled with laughter and life, became a scene of unimaginable horror. The only child who escaped was Noah, the youngest. He had been asleep during the initial commotion and woke up to the sound of sirens as first responders. Noah had managed to sneak out of the house unnoticed, running barefoot into the street, where a neighbor found him and called the police. When authorities arrived, they found Jamarcus's car missing, Lindsay and the 3 older children dead, and Noah in shock but unharmed. The scene inside the house was grim, the silence only broken by the muffled sobs of neighbors who had gathered outside. Jamarcus drove aimlessly for hours, his mind replaying the events over and over. The weight of what he had done began to sink in, and he felt an overwhelming mix of regret and emptiness. He eventually stopped in the Mojave Desert, where he discarded the gun before heading to a Los Angeles County Sheriff's Station. There, he walked in and calmly confessed to the murders, his voice devoid of emotion. News of the tragedy spread quickly, leaving the area in shock. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of Jamarcus as a hardworking father with the horrific acts he had committed. The story dominated headlines, with many debating the role of betrayal, mental health, and unresolved anger in leading to such a catastrophic outcome. During the trial, Jamarcus showed little emotion as prosecutors laid out the details of the murders. The defense attempted to argue that the discovery of Lindsay's betrayal had pushed him into a temporary state of insanity, but the jury was unmoved. The evidence was overwhelming, and the cold, calculated nature of his actions left little room for sympathy. On January 15, 2022, Jamarcus Lamar David was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The court imposed special circumstances for multiple murders, ensuring that Jamarcus would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Noah, who had been placed with relatives, sat quietly in the courtroom, clutching a photo of his mother and siblings. This story serves as a devastating reminder of the consequences of betrayal and unchecked anger. It highlights the importance of communication, trust, and seeking help during times of emotional turmoil. The tragedy in Lancaster will forever be etched in the minds of those who knew the family, a grim example of how quickly lives can be torn apart when pain turns into violence. For more interesting stories, check this one out.